Subjectivity. Couple of things. That's a very clever Argentine, that's the peso, not the dollar, Argentine street seller who worked out that if you're American and don't speak Spanish, jugo de naranja just means orange juice, but passing Yankee tourists can be gouged for an extra 25% on their orange juice. I think that's a brilliant example of price discrimination. Basically, value is subjective. Any idea, Marxists are obsessed with the idea of objective value, which is a product of the Labour theory of value. But actually, our own theories of value are deeply whack, because there is no intrinsic human capability to attach a unit of currency or value to a unit of pain or a unit of pleasure. All we can do is operate within the category or within the frame of reference. In fact, this is true of everything. Loudness, pain, temperature. We can either say a bit more than, a lot more than, about the same, a bit less, or a lot less, of any measure. The one tiny and rare exception is perfect pitch, which some people have, which is the only case of humans seeming to have an absolute measure of any particular thing. This is a good example. Next time you go to Waitrose or Tesco, buy this tea, okay? It's Twining's Tea Deli English Breakfast and 25 tea bags, £6. You're all looking at that absolutely scandalised, as indeed was I. And I looked at this and said, you're having a laugh. This is utterly absurd. You know, you pay 2p for a tea bag. And then I suddenly thought, this is purely my own frame of reference about how much you pay for tea. Now, if you think about it, we've all paid, that's 24p per tea bag. We've all paid £3 for a really crap glass of wine. We've all paid, £2.50 for a not very good coffee. We've all paid hundreds of times in our lives, tens of pounds for really, really crap experiences. So actually, 24p for an incredibly good cup of tea isn't bad at all. But our brains cannot think like that, because all we can do is actually look at the reference frame and work backwards. So actually, when you think about it, 24p, if you think of the pleasure a fantastic cup of tea can give, and there are a hell of a lot of things we spend more than 24p on that give us less pleasure than that. I think it's probably fair to say, isn't it? And yet, we are still scandalised by that price because we have an idea of what tea should cost. Rolls-Royce, interestingly, when they sell the Phantom, they exploit this framing effect. It's a 350,000, don't hibernate. It's a 350,000 euro car, and yet, if you put it in a car show, everybody walks out going, it's bloody rip-off, we're not buying that. So what Rolls-Royce do with the Phantom is they sell it at yacht shows and plane shows. And exactly the same people walk out, they've spent the whole day looking at a $6 million yacht, or they've spent the day looking at a quarter share of a Learjet, and on the way out they see the car and they go, have a couple of those. If you can actually shift someone's frame of reference, you can make a fortune. Anybody here got an espresso machine? A few, yeah. They are brilliant, aren't they? I mean, you wouldn't sacrifice it for the world. Now, the interesting thing about this machine is you buy the coffee in a pod, which is a single shot of real coffee. If you do the calculation in terms of how much you're paying, it's a bit like buying a jar of Nescafe for 200 quid, okay? Now, none of you would ever pay 200 quid for a jar of Nescafe. You would be scandalised, whatever promise was made, even if the freeze-dried coffee had been rolled on the thighs of Cuban maidens, or whatever, you wouldn't buy that coffee for 200 quid. Yet brilliantly, because the Nespresso capsules come in a pod, our frame of reference is different. It's not with a teaspoon from the jar of coffee, it's with Starbucks. And so you go, well, normally I go and pay 2 quid at Starbucks, so actually having this coffee at home for 26p is a bargain. If you can shift that frame of reference, the comparative set of anything, it's a perfect way of making a fortune. Well, I mean, let's find out and probably talk on. I'll extemporise excitingly. But that's one of the exciting things, that actually value is completely subjective. And one of my defences of advertising is that actually the human value set, how we're programmed to value things, is designed effectively evolutionary for a completely different age. We broadly speaking have a value mentality which comes from about 3 million years ago, or possibly more if you look at experiments with chimpanzees, who also seem to have a sort of, a rudimentary economic sense. And the extraordinary thing that emerges is really that one disastrous value set that humans possess in environmental terms is scarcity value. We disproportionately value things that are scarce, like diamonds, simply because they're scarce. In fact, there are examples through economic history of people not valuing things when they were abundant and suddenly valuing them massively when they were scarce. I come from Monmouthshire and the Welsh borders, and in the 19th century, agricultural workers went on strike, and one of their demands was not being made to eat salmon more than 3 times a week. Because salmon was so abundant there, it was effectively the kind of Big Mac of its day, and actually it was abundant and it was considered rubbish. Suddenly salmon gets rare and it becomes an absolutely premium good. Now that in environmental terms is hugely damaging. If advertising can do anything to make us value things differently, it is not by its nature. First of all, what it's tinkering with is no absolute sense of value to start with. Secondly, it's not by its nature necessarily making things worse. 2 things where advertising could very healthily intervene in terms of environmental improvement. 1, scarcity value, making people value what's cheap, abundant and pretty good rather than what's wonderfully rare. So people do not say, I must make my furniture out of the rarest Brazilian hardwoods, okay? A second one is probably ownership bias. If we could all learn to actually enjoy renting stuff and enjoy experiences that we rent that may involve no particular environmental degradation more and value possession less, if we could learn to derive as much pleasure from actually joining a really good car club as we do from actually buying a car, that's also something where the world could be made actually a better and happier place through literally slightly jiggling with our inbuilt value mechanism. What's the next one? It's coming on, fine, fantastic. But that's just really important. If you understand that actually value is purely subjective, one of the most interesting things is that you can actually synthesize it. You can actually add value to it by getting someone to look at it differently. And what you're doing when you do that is you effectively synthesize value. By getting someone to look at that tea bag and going, actually, I'd always thought that tea bags were only worth 2p, but suddenly I'm thinking about this differently, what you've actually done is created greater appreciation of something which we're likely to take for granted. Now, as the world shifts from problems of stuff, how do we manufacture and distribute enough stuff, to actually a secondary problem, no longer actually a clock problem, but a cloud problem, which is how do you get people to appreciate the stuff we already have? I think the skill that lies in this room becomes progressively more important, and the skills that lie in the clock people actually become less important and in some cases actually damaging. Here's another thing from cloud mentality, complementarity. Not very popular with finance guys. Finance guys like every element of a business to wash its own face, to be completely self-liquidating and to make it generate its own profit as far as is possible. Complementarity is the theory that Becker and Murphy developed for how advertising works. That advertising is a good, the consumption of which is complementary to the consumption of the main good. Free peanuts in a bar, beer. Okay? The beer you pay for, the peanuts are free, but the peanuts make you enjoy the beer more, they create thirst for the beer, and they mean you consume more beer. 2 Nobel Prize-winning economists, Becker and Murphy, claim that's exactly how advertising works. It's through complementarity. It's through actually creating something, the consumption of the advertisement makes my appreciation and consumption and usage of the product more enjoyable and more rewarding. Now, sometimes, as I said, accountants don't like that kind of complementarity because they believe that, every single business unit the peanuts department has to actually generate a profit. What this suggests actually is there's a very, very big role in business for large amounts of cross-subsidy. There are bits we want to pay for, beer, and there are bits we don't, peanuts. I've often jokingly said if you put a finance guy into a lap dancing club, okay, he'd be completely uncomfortable because he'd say, as far as I can see, we've got this extraordinarily profitable bar business here, selling cider for £150 a bottle, but then these naked girls appear to be a complete overhead, okay? The fact is you can't sell cider for £150 unless you've got the naked girls. Now, what's interesting about this complementarity theory of advertising is it's an incredibly liberating, particularly for digital people, particularly liberating way of looking at what can be advertising. In France, the Michelin Guide is information and a book which is complementary to the consumption of tyre rubber. Michelin had a vast dominance of the French tyre industry, and the problem they realised is that it wasn't they couldn't get any more market share. Their problem was simply that French people weren't driving far enough. And the reason for this is French people won't drive anywhere unless they know there's a restaurant at the end of it. basically. So what they did is they created the Michelin Guide to encourage French people to go further afield, to visit places that were 50 miles from home rather than 10. And as a result, complimentary, sell the guide, sell the tyres. This was the British equivalent because we didn't have any restaurants at the time. But actually the Shell guides written by John Betjeman and others were effectively looking at churches and information about interesting sites, complimentary to the consumption of Shell petrol. A very liberating and interesting concept. Understanding that people psychologically, there are things people, the nature of complementary value is something that actually isn't very well accounted for in plenty of traditional business approaches to finance. This is another great example of complementarity. Can we have the next one? Ooh. I'll describe it. What it is, it's a... are we moving on? And there we are, yeah, My Sky Status. This was done by a digital agency, I think in London. It's for Lufthansa, but it's not only for Lufthansa. You simply put your Twitter and your Facebook account into this site and link the site, tell it which flight you're going on, and it automatically tweets or posts to your wall on Facebook when your flight takes off, when you're midway through the flight, if it's a long flight, and when your flight lands. Very useful to 3 points in which you're not allowed to use a mobile phone. But actually, it's a cute little service. I'm not suggesting it's a cancer cure, but it's a very sweet thing. What's clever about it is it's not only Lufthansa flights, it works for every single flight. As a result of which, what's brilliant about this is, 95% of Americans have never heard of Lufthansa, and the other 5% think they saw it on the Discovery Channel flying ME-109s over the English Channel. So as a result, what this does is it's a fantastic way of just building in an awareness of Lufthansa through a perfect example of complementarity. This is a service that's complementary to the consumption of air travel. Framing effects. I mentioned that framing effect of Rolls-Royce. This is a really vital thing to understand in terms of human biases. And the example I'm most passionate about, which is another case where I think advertising can tweak can actually help environmentally, is the terrible mis-selling of video conferencing and video and telepresence. And the reason is very, very simple. One terrible mistake was made. Understandably, but perhaps, I hope not, uneradicably. And that mistake was that every time someone sold video conferencing, they sold it not as the rich man's phone call, but as the poor man's substitute for air travel. So it was always sold as an inferior and cheaper version of a flight, not as a superior version of a phone call. As a result of which, it became a bit like the pager. You remember the pager became a thing for your employer gave you if they didn't trust you with a mobile phone. I'm not going to give Rory a bloody mobile phone. He'll just start yakking all over the place and I'll never be able to get... I'll give him a pager. That means he can be at my beck and call. This thing was more or less the same. It said, look, we don't actually trust you to go to Frankfurt on a business meeting because you only get pissed and raid the minibar and embarrass us all. But tell you what, you can go down to a small basement room in your office and you can stare at some people in some jerky images for 2 hours because that's about the limit of our trust for you. Now, by selling that, that is the framing effect. It's been sold... I more or less said at Ogilvy at WPP, if you want this to take off, you have to install that thing in the chief executive's office and nowhere else. Suddenly then all the middle management will want one, okay? But the second you put it in a basement room, the thing's dead. If I'd been Cisco, I would have made it a condition of installation. If you want to know an example of where this worked, it worked brilliantly with post-it notes, which are a double example of creativity. First of all, as someone realizing that having invented a glue that didn't really work, they could find an application for it, which was kind of ingenious. Knight's Nurse was a similar point. They'd actually developed a very good cold cure, but they discovered it sent people violently and dramatically to sleep in an outbreak of narcolepsy.